Hello, everyone. Hope you are doing well. Happy Wednesday to you. As we head into week 3 of the class and finish up Trio, I wanted to make a quick video just to kind of recap, go over a couple of key concepts from Silencing the Past, discuss a little bit about and comment on a few things that you guys brought up in discussion, and also look forward to what we are going to be engaging with this week. So let's get started. Uh, One of the things that I really enjoy about teaching this book is that it is very rich and complex. I first encountered Silence in the Past back in the ancient days of my own grad school career as an MA student, and it has become one of those, I guess, sort of landmark texts for me in terms of really understanding how history works and also understanding why history matters in the bigger picture, beyond just our own maybe personal intellectual interest, right? How history has this much greater significance beyond what we often assume. And so I love teaching it. Right, it's one of those things that I don't know if many of you who are teachers, you have certain concepts or certain topics that you really get excited about and you really enjoy, and you want to see students latch onto. So hopefully, this is so far an engaging text for you. It seems like from discussion, most of you are getting some interesting stuff out of it. So hope that is the case. So let's go over. I wanted to recap a few kind of key concepts from Trio's work. And he opens his book. Well, we'll go back to the preface here in a minute, but he opens the first chapter of the book discussing the. He uses the reference of the site of the Alamo, the Battle of the Alamo, right, and this uh, contests about the significance of the Alamo, about the actual events that happened there, and how we define history. And he uses this sense of, he latches onto this idea that history is both, we talk about history as being what has happened in the past, and we talk about history as the retelling of what has happened in the past, right? Which I'll talk a bit more about. But he looks at the Alamo as this example of a historical event that is known widely, but has a very specific narrative around it that has been shaped by a variety of forces, right, throughout history that have been influential in helping preserve the history of the Alamo, tell a certain narrative about the history of the Alamo. One of the initial phrases, right, that comes out of that event is to remember the Alamo, right? So it's a really perfect case study for him in understanding the way that history works, right? And so he talks about also about how the memory of the narrative of the Alamo was perpetuated through paintings and through written narratives and through songs and through movies, right? And has become this historical narrative that serves particular agendas, right? And so he really wants us to think closely about um, you know how those stories get created, why they get created, and of course the role of power in that. So in that discussion about the definition of history, oh, and I did want to say here, I think the Alamo is also a great metaphor in a lot of ways for what Trio wants to say, because I was looking online for some pictures of the Alamo and saw this aerial view, and it's fascinating because, of course, the way that we often see the Alamo in pictures online or in books or something, or if you were a visitor to the site, you see the classic facade, right? The historical facade of the building, and it allows you this fantasy or this understanding that I am in this place that is, I'm immersed in the past here, right? I am at the actual site that is, I'm having this real encounter with the past. But of course, this aerial view shows us that there's all sorts of other things going on, right? That if you look up here, you've got air conditioning units, right? You've got this modern, sort of cruciform metal build a roof that's going on here, right? And so it's a great it's a great metaphor, I think, for looking at a particular narrative of the past and believing it to be the past, but not seeing all of the plumbing and the ductwork and the modern stuff that gets put onto our narratives about the past, right? So I just kind of like that as a way of thinking about the Alamo as an example of Trio's ideas. Right? But going back to this discussion about the two meanings of history, right? So Trio wants us to see that there are, he says, there are two different ways that we talk about history, and he eventually calls them historicity 1 and historicity 2. So historicity 1 is what happened, right? The actual events of the past, and of course of the present, right? That are ongoing, right? It's the course of human history. And then historicity 2 is what is said to have happened, right? So the stories that we tell about the past. Historicity 2 is claiming to recreate or narrate historicity 1, right? And he uses that to then break down these two different schools of thought about historical scholarship, historical narratives, historical research, how we understand the past, right? And so his first is the what he calls positivism, right? That sees very much itself as neutral, that it believes that historical narratives are simply looking at the facts, and then that dictates the narrative, right? So the goal of positivism is that classic formulation, which if you took historiography, you've learned well, Leopold von Ranke's "The Past as It Really Was," right? That we can uncover and objectively describe the past as it was. And the other school that he calls constructivism. I'm going to move my window out of the way here. Constructivism says there is no, there's no knowable way. It's almost agnostic about the past, right? There's no real understanding. There's no way to know what really happened. And so H2, historicity 2, is really all we have. And so then narratives are constructed, right? They're shaped by the purposes of their creators. There's not an external reality to which they refer, right? And so, positivists see historians as these outside observers, right? That aren't affected by the historical process. They are able to observe it like scientists, right? Who can observe an experiment and see the impact of it. They are, they're observing the effects of microorganisms, some variable that they throw into that, right? They're not affected by it. They're separate from it. And so that divide is really important, Trio says. He says that they imagine that there's this division, and so they're separate. They're out of that context of what has happened and how it has been shaped, how our understanding of the past has been shaped by the historical process. Meanwhile, constructivists almost think of historical narratives like collage, right? That when we're constructing a historical narrative, we're just taking bits and pieces from the Mona Lisa and Minnie Mouse's hair bow. And Minnie Mouse doesn't even have hair. How does she have a hair bow? I don't really understand. And we're mashing those together to create something that serves the particular purposes of the creator or their goals or their biases, right? And so, of course, Trio says that I think Trio definitely thinks that and argues that historical narratives are constructed, right? He definitely thinks that positivists he calls naive, right? To think that you are able to, collect all of the facts about the past and to reconstruct them in a way that's accurate, and true, so to speak. And so he definitely agrees that historical narratives are constructed, but where he thinks constructivists go too far is in saying that these are endlessly variable, right? And that there's no relationship to reality. And so what he wants to do is really get out of that debate. I'm going to see if I can move myself out of the way. Well, I'll have to do it in a couple of ways. But he says, the search for the nature of history has led us to deny ambiguity and either to demarcate precisely and at all times the dividing line between historical process and historical knowledge, that's positivism, or to conflate at all times historical process and historical narrative, right? So thus, between the mechanically realist and the naively constructivist extremes, he says there's the more serious task of determining not what history is, right? We could debate this all, endlessly. He says we should stop worrying about this. He says, but in fact, we need to understand how history works, right? How history works. We need to know the mechanics of this. For what history is changes with time and place, or better said, history reveals itself only through the production of specific narratives. What matters most are the process and conditions of production of such narratives, right? So the process and conditions, right? Who, in particular, he wants us to focus on that, on power, right? So he says only a focus on that process can uncover the ways in which the two sides of historicity intertwine in a particular context. Right? Only through that overlap can we discover the differential exercise of power that makes some narratives possible and silences others. Right? So Triot says we need to look at historical narratives. We need to think about who was in power, at different moments in the creation of a narrative, right? Because he says power doesn't enter the historical narrative at any one point, but at multiple points throughout the creation of narratives. And he says that ultimately we cannot deny, and we have to face, constructivists have to face what he calls the materiality of the socio-historical process, right? So he says, the most dangerous extreme for constructivists is Holocaust denial, right? If you're going to say that all historical narratives are equal, then you have to give equal time to Holocaust deniers. You have to say, sure, all of these are equally viable narratives about the past. And he says, no, right? There is an Auschwitz, right? There is a Birkenau. There are these places. There are things that are left behind from the past, right? That do tell us something, that ground us quite literally in reality, right? Buildings, texts, objects, right? All the stuff left over from the past, right? And we have to grapple with that. It doesn't allow us to just simply create history as a sort of endless amount, number of fictions. And so he really wants, us to grapple with then how does history work? We can't just say, sure, it's whatever you want it to be. All of these are essentially fictions. We can't pretend that we have this sort of truth that we can get to. We have to understand how these narratives get constructed. And so he's navigating this way between those extremes. And of course, he wants us to know and remind us that, as he says in the preface, this book is about history and power, deals with the many ways in which the production of historical narratives involves the uneven contribution of competing groups, right? So yes, people, power influences historical narratives, but not everyone has the same level of power. Not everyone has the same ability within a particular moment to exercise power. Right? And the competing groups and individuals who have unequal access to the means for such production. Right? If you're familiar with your Marx, you'll see Triot's Marxist roots showing here, right? That we're talking about access to the means of production, right? So he's really interested in how history is used as this instrument of power. And he says the forces I will expose are less visible than gunfire, class property, or political crusades. I want to argue they are no less powerful, right? That these narratives mean something, right? They have a dramatic impact on our world, right? How we think about the past, this is the classic Orwellian statement, right? That he who controls the present controls the past, and he who controls the past controls the future, right? What is our trajectory? Where are we going? What's an acceptable direction to go in? What's an unacceptable? What's too much of a departure from who we are as a people, as a society, as a nation, right? Triot argues this stuff matters, right? This is vitally important. And talking about unequal access to means of production, he goes, go back to the materiality from the socio-historical process, right? That there's unequal preservation and remains from the past, right? So he compares the two sans soucis that one is in ruins, right? One is surrounded by poverty, right? One is, very scant in the historical record, right? The other at Potsdam, Frederick the Great Sanssouci, is a major tourist site. It's beautifully preserved, right? It has all of this rich art within it, right? And this kind of beauty, and it is part of Western culture, right? So again, that's a classic example of there are two different. There's unequal access. There's unequal material remains that the past leaves behind because of differences of power, right? And so, then of course, Trio wants us to understand this concept of silences, right? That there are always points within the creation of historical narrative, starting from the very beginning, that determine and shape that historical narrative, right? And these are inescapable, right? Trio says that they are simply a part of the process of creating historical narratives, and in fact, they're often a useful part, right? And he is the example of the sportscaster, right? That if the sportscaster tried to describe everything to you, it wouldn't be a useful understanding of the game, right? There are choices that are made there. But he says that these start at these different moments, right? And the first one is, of course, sources, right? Not everything that happens is recorded. Not everything is considered important by whoever is creating a record. That is, not everything's considered significant. Oh, we got to write this down, right? Or we need to save this thing that we wrote down, right? And so things get filtered out right there. And sometimes those actors who are in the moment are intentionally trying to already create a historical narrative for the future, right? They're already thinking about how will this be seen in the future. Other times they're simply recording it for some other purpose, right? And so, sometimes this is about bias and agendas and ways that people want to shape perceptions of themselves, right? If someone's writing a, biography or something that they expect will be read by the public. Other times it's just simply a process of the choices we make in our life every day, right? So not everything is recorded, not everything is preserved, not everything's considered significant. And then, of course, we get to archives, right? That not everything that even those things that get preserved, not everything is saved, or else we would all look like, all of our houses would look like hoarders. We'd be on reality TV shows. Not everything is preserved. There's judgments about significance and what matters. So archives exert tremendous power over historical narratives. What do historians do when they go to do research? They go into archives, right? And they see what documents are there. I remember a very specific example of this. When I was doing research for my book, I went to the William Donald Schaefer administration papers at the Baltimore City Archives. William Donald Schaefer was this mayor of Baltimore in the 70s who did a lot of interesting work to try to revive the city and to do all these different things. And first of all, think about archives and the difficulties of accessing archives. The Baltimore City Archives was it was not in sort of a library or at a university or in a city administration building that was in the center of downtown. No. It was way out in like West Baltimore in this warehouse that was down this kind of rundown industrial neighborhood street, right? So, and at the time, this was, I don't know, 2000, probably 2009, 2010. There was almost no information about the city archives online. I finally tracked down a phone number somewhere and called them and got the address and finally got there. And then the guy, hands me the finding aid. I look through it to find some things I want. And he says, okay, well, go back there and get them, right? Go back into this warehouse and there's just 1,200 boxes. It's like the last scene from the Indiana Jones Raiders of the Lost Ark, right? It's just this giant warehouse, and there's like 1,200 of these bankers' boxes that are full of the papers of the William Donald Schaefer administration, right? So there was so much of a challenge to get to the archives, and then finding stuff in the archives was very difficult. The finding aid was not great, right? Then after, months later, I got in contact with one of the nice things about doing research about people from the relatively recent past is they might still be alive, right? And maybe they have Facebook accounts or something. And I tracked down one of his chief assistants who was in his administration, one of his chief aides. And I said, hey, can I interview you, right? Just to get some perspective on some of these things. Great, we did that. And we're talking, and she made this kind of very casual statement to me. She said, yeah, well, he didn't write a lot of things down, right? I mean, we did these major projects, we did these things, we built these parks, we did all these things, and we never put anything on paper. He liked to make phone calls, right? And reflecting back on it, it was such a striking point to me because I thought there were 1,200 bankers boxes, right? The big giant document boxes there, spanning all kinds of subjects. And you would think that would be a really comprehensive record. And she just told me that he didn't write a lot of things down, right? So again, you get these silences, right, that are never going to be understood or known. So again, archives decide what's important. They have limited space, they have limited staffing and capacity to catalog and to make things available to historians. That creates silences, right? And then, of course, when we get into narrative, right, not everything is useful to the purposes of a narrator, right? Again, if we go back to my example, when writing about Baltimore in the 1970s, I was not interested in what the mayor was doing with regards to I don't know, updating the sewer system, right? It wasn't particularly important to me. I was more interested in development of tourist sites and kind of economic redevelopment. I wasn't interested in what they were really doing around, the schools within Baltimore City. There was all these things, right? So not everything was useful to me. Again, you're narrowing down, right? And then, of course, there's the concept of retrospective significance. Not every story is celebrated. Not every story is considered important, right? Not every historical fact is even considered a fact, right? He talks a lot about fact creation and what that means. And note that this may have no correlation to significance in the past, right? His discussion of Columbus, which is coming up in our next part, is a great example of this, right? In which really our significance that we have given to Columbus in retrospect is much greater than anyone gave it at the time, and much would be a surprise, I think, to a lot of contemporaries of Columbus. So then his last one is the historical narratives, right? The making of historical narratives. And here he wants to remind us that every narrative is, of course, a particular bundle of silences. It has its own particular choices that have been made over time, right? And all of this is kind of shaped by what I'm somewhat facetiously calling the funnel of power here, right? That over time, our accepted past, our narratives about the past, are fundamentally shaped by these choices that are made beforehand that eliminate so much of the past for us. Now, if I were really wanting to spend a whole lot of time in slides and diagramming, you also could have different branches going out here, right? That different narratives about the past may emphasize some parts of this, right, and not other parts. And so, again, our historical narratives are contingent. They're constructed. Choices are made by people in the present who are themselves experiencing a socio-historical process, and so have these certain values and assumptions that are shaping their work to construct a narrative of the past. All that makes it any assumptions or ideas about history being straightforward and simple almost impossible to take seriously. A couple of other things that stood out to me. One of them is that a number of you discussed Trieu's discussion of power in the context of Foucault, which I thought was great. It's really neat to see a number of you already having had Dr. Bergman's historiography class to then be able to connect that back, and you were able to say, "Oh yeah, this reminds us, of Foucault's conceptions of power," right? And that's absolutely on target. I was excited to see that. Like, yes, right. So Michel and Michel Rolfe, what do they have to say to one another, right? I like having both these pictures also because most pictures of Foucault are very serious and brooding, and seems like he's like an eternal angst or intellectual ferment. And it's good to remember these people are just people also, right? And I like this for the same reason. This picture of Trio. Um, but both Michel Foucault and Triot would say that power is everywhere, right? It's baked into how society works, how people relate to one another. That part of power is defining what are accepted forms of knowledge and truth, right? Triot talks about Western conceptions of historical evidence, and are there other societies that might have other criteria for those, but they do have their own criteria. They have their own grammar. They have their own rules for historical narratives, right? Both would say that power is discursive, right? That there's an interplay between those people. Power is not just top down, right? There are different ways in which power is exerted, even by those who seem to be on the lower rungs of society. And similar to that, it's not only repressive or coercive. It can be directed toward things that we think are good, right? But we have to understand that it's there, right? And we have to analyze the way that it works within society, within institutions, within history, right? And so, though surprisingly, he only references Foucault, I think maybe once or twice in the book. Certainly, there's so much overlap here between these two thinkers, right? So that was really great to see. And I will say, overall, very, on the whole, the class discussion this week was very rich, and probably, I think, taught this book so many times. It was really one of the better discussions in terms of your understanding of concepts right off the bat, and so that was really good to see, and I think also benefits from, again, many of you having had Dr. Berman's historiography course before this one. So that's